Yeah, all looking okay, brilliant. Right, so I've titled this talk Introduction to the Computer Arts Archive, and it really is a presentation that I was planning on giving next month at the EVA conference. So the EVA conference is the annual, the London one is an annual electronic visualization and the arts conference that the Computer Arts Society is co-organises and been associated with for many years now. And these conferences run all over the world, and typically I try to have a presentation ready for the annual EVA conference. And this year's presentation was going to be introducing the Computer Arts Archive. But of course, things have changed, and I think there's a chance that we'll have an EVA later in the year, but it certainly isn't going to happen in July. So I thought there was an opportunity maybe to talk about this presentation. I'll talk about this topic and really test out this presentation, and maybe I'll give it again later in the year. So introducing the Computer Arts Archive. Just have to make sure I'm on the right window. Great. So first of all, a little bit of background. A number of people here have been members of the Computer Arts Society far longer than me, and they will probably know more about it than me, but I thought it might be useful for me to give a little bit of background for those people who are attending these sessions and maybe don't know quite so much about the Computer Arts Society. So it was established in 1968, and it was very much in the wake of the Cybernetic Serendipity exhibition, which is regarded as a very important seminal exhibition that occurred also in 1968. It was curated by Yasha Reichart, and it was one of the first exhibitions to bring together people who might call themselves computer artists, and certainly work that we would now regard as computer arts. And three attendees of that exhibition, John Lansdowne, Alan Sutcliffe and George Mallon, decided that it would be useful to have a society that would bring together the diverse range of sort of interests in computer arts, with the arts being particularly important. Arts rather than computer art, it's not one thing. And so in 1968 they established a society, they organised regular meetings and events, and they began to publish a newsletter called Page, which was originally edited by Gustav Metzger, who people may know through his work with auto-destructive art. If you're not familiar with his work, actually we have some videos that I've collected and put on the Computer Arts Society YouTube channel. Very interesting artist. And it was set up to be became a specialist group of the British Computer Society. British Computer Society is the professional society for computer scientists, primarily in the UK. It's a bit broader than that now, because computing itself as a topic has broadened. Still remains as it's now referred to as the BCS rather than British Computer Society, but still remains as a very important professional society. I tend to see the Computer Arts Society in a number of phases, really. The original society from 1968 ran really until 1985. It organised events, the event one, Interact. It published Page, and in particular at the beginning it was very prolific in publishing Page, maybe every 2 months. But the society, for reasons that we may touch on a little later, actually stopped in 1985. And then there was this hiatus period from 85 to 2004, maybe 2002, when the society didn't exist. But of course, digital art was happening still. Maybe there wasn't a need for a computer art society at the time. Maybe the people who called themselves computer artists had changed. It would be an interesting thing to look at. And I have a few little projects where we might look at this in the future. And then in 2002, a research project started, the CAS project at Birkbeck College. And this was funded to look at the archives of the original society. So from 1968 to 1985. There were members of the project, Nick Lambert, who's still the chair of Computer Arts Society, Paul Brown was involved, a number of curators. The full list of people are on some websites that I have that I'll share with you. And the CAS project was followed by the Computer Art and Technocultures project. And so throughout the 2000s, there was research being done looking at the original society, making sure that the archives were collected and sorted and preserved. But there was also the new society, the re-established society in 2004, which really was aimed to meet the original aims, which was to promote and support computer arts, and saw a new generation of artists really get involved in the society. Now, I've also put an important, maybe watershed date in 2009, 2010, where the results of much of this research were presented at a number of events and meetings, primarily based around the V&A and the BCS. But we have a lot of recorded materials from this time, and that sort of marked the end of this looking at the early phases of the Computer Arts Society and making sure that the archives were preserved. Now, most of the work went to the V&A, and the V&A now has a very significant collection of early computer artworks. Their collections, they've added to them over the years, and it really is a very important collection in the UK, but I think also internationally as well. And so the Computer Arts Society then, in 2010 onwards, became, as a member of the, or a group of the British Computer Society, its own group really, where perhaps it was looking, after having done maybe 10 years of a lot of research into the early phase, maybe it was ready to really take on this new phase and maybe offer something new to this new generation of artists. So I really personally, I became involved in around about that 2008, 2009 time. For me, it coincided with having just finished a master's degree and looking to move on to do a PhD, and the Computer Arts Society was a very valuable organisation for me to meet many of the pioneering artists, but also to meet some of those pioneering artists are still practicing, but contemporary artists as well. So for me, I got involved around about then. And actually, I took over the maintenance of the website in around about 2012. And I really looked at that as a project where maybe I could start collecting some of those materials online that perhaps hadn't been fully digitized. Many of them had been, but hadn't yet been shared. So I've really I suppose I spent the last 8 years or so just working to make sure that as much of the Computer Arts Society's early material and its contemporary activities are documented on the website. So the first thing I'd like to do is probably pop over to that website and show you a few things. So this is where I hope everything works as planned. So you should now have seamlessly gone to the Computer Arts Society website. Does that look okay to people? I will probably assume it is, unless somebody jumps in and tells me that it's not working properly. So what you have here is the Computer Arts Society website as it currently stands. So this is the live site now. Now, the section at the moment I want to draw your attention to is the archive here. So if we look at the CAS Archive, this is an area where many people, Nick, Paul Brown and others, have been collecting material, partly through those early research projects, but also through their own activities. And they've been sharing that material with me, and I've been making sure it goes into our website. Now we have the CAS YouTube channel. I'll come back to that a little bit later on because that's really something where we're doing some new work. But if we look at some of the historic work we have in our archive, now I think the first thing is that we have a complete collection now of the Page magazine. So what affects most of these pages I've gone from new to old, which means I have to scroll to the bottom to go through them chronologically. But if we go right down to the bottom here, we see the early Page magazines. The first Page came out in April 1969. And of course, these were bulletin board publications in a style that we don't necessarily see so much now. They would have been pinned on bulletin boards and shared companies, academics, maybe some arts groups and so on. And what you have through Page is a really interesting early-ish history of computer art, not just in the UK. Some of these publications go beyond, or feature articles and artists beyond the UK. But as you can see, 1970 and 71. So in this year, so there were 7 issues in 1971. Continues through to 1972, 73, a few fewer. And then you can see they become a little bit more sporadic, but still very interesting publications, going right up to the end of phase 1, if you like, of CAS, these were actually being edited at what was Leicester Polytechnic, which is De Montfort University, where I did my research with Ernest and the Institute of Creative Technologies. And up to 85, where you see this first phase of Page, which is a very useful resource. Now, the V&A have a complete collection of Page magazine on paper. So if you ever want to see the paper-based ones, you can go there. What we have quite, in this sort of archive, we have some duplicates, some copies of some of the early ones, but the task really, the goal initially was to get them all online. And the good thing is that Google is rather clever and it's indexed most of them, so they're pretty searchable as well. So if you use the search facility on the Computer Arts Society website, it will search these PDF documents. And then you see here the newer phase of Page magazines. Again, moderately sporadic, but still very interesting. And Paul Brown is the editor, has been the editor, I think, of all of these. And we're going up to this 2004, where the Society restarted. A lot of these articles are reporting on the research that has been done and looking at the original archives. Right the way up to the more recent ones, again, quite sporadic, but these two were special issues in collaboration with the Lumen Prize, the annual Computer Arts Prize, and so on. So the first thing, I think the first achievement we did really in terms of looking how we might update the CAS archive was to get a complete section of Page magazines. We've also got a pretty complete section of the articles written by John Lansdowne, one of the co-founders of the Society, where he looks at a whole range of different topics. And these were published in the BCS, British Computer Society magazine. And again, I think a fascinating read. It sort of documents a time really. And this actually goes up a little bit later because he was still working in the 90s writing these. So we have an interesting collection there. We have some early CAS documents. I think you can go through, I won't go through everything in detail, but you can go through those. We have a collection of articles. Now we're looking at the sort of newer CAS phase, written by Catherine Mason. All of these. It's interesting to see there are a few artists who are in both phases, but there are plenty of new artists here associated with CAS. Not all of them associated with CAS. I think this one here was an article about Grayson Perry, but computer arts and digital arts up until about 2014. So what you see is that we've started to build up quite an interesting archive here. In fact, I will show you this page. This is just a small section of some of the archives that are now at the V&A. So the CAS project collected these, documented, ordered them and so on, and then handed them over to the V&A for preservation. And you'll often see some of these images coming up in the V&A exhibitions when they look at past or present of computer arts. I selected these ones because I use these in some of my teaching work. For example, I will often show, I'll show this image to students, very famous image here of the increasingly random squares, Schotter by George Nice. And I will try and get students to understand this image by constructing it. So, and it's interesting because some of the tools that we have available now, clearly they're far more powerful, but it's valuable to learn how these images have been constructed, get an insight maybe into some of these early computer art. And so we have a great selection of images there, but really the best place to see all of these is in the V&A collections, where they have a great index of all of them. So one other thing I'll show you before moving on is I thought I would start documenting, again I have to go to the bottom here, the exhibitions that I went to, starting with the very early, I say early, not in terms of the Computer Arts Society, but the exhibitions and activities that were happening in 2009, 2010, where the V&A was presenting an exhibition of digital pioneers as well as the Decode exhibition, and I got assorted pictures. And then every time I went to what I felt was a relevant exhibition, I would take pictures and put these up on the website. And what I ended up realizing I had here was not a complete catalogue of all the digital art exhibitions in the UK. That wouldn't have been possible, but still a fairly interesting one in terms of cataloguing exhibitions that will have featured Computer Art Society members. So we had the Automatic Art exhibition here, AI, so that was 6 years ago now, Paul Brown and Son, and so on. So on this website, Ernest's exhibition here, Technology is Not Neutral. So on the CAS website, I started collecting a lot of archival materials, and I think you could probably spend quite a lot of time looking through these if you wanted to. We also made sure that those research projects I've talked about a number of times, their work was captured, their materials were captured. So we have the CAS website archive now on here, Nick Lambert's thesis, which his PhD came out of, was done in parallel with that early research project, and the Computer Art and Technocultures project as well. So again, you have more material here, and we'll come on to these two a bit later. Probably before I stop talking about the older parts, I should mention these publications. Computer in the Art Room by Catherine Mason, and White Heat Cold Logic by Paul Brown, Catherine Mason, Charlie Gear and Nick Lambert, and Doug Dodds' book here, Digital Pioneers, published at the same time as that exhibition. I see these on Amazon quite a bit, going at really great prices, you know, sort of $10 or something like that. So I would make sure, if you're interested in early, up to 1980s computer art, you get hold of these very important books, I think. Okay, so I've begun a process of adding to and developing the online archives. And then I thought about maybe collecting some original artworks or copies of artworks and forming a collection that I thought we could call the CAS50 Collection. Now, the reason for wanting to build this collection was a simple one, in that it was 50 years since the formation of the Computer Art Society. So from 1968, although people say 1968, it might have been 1969. I can never get a definitive answer of the actual start date of the Computer Art Society. But 2018, 2019 certainly represented a 50-year anniversary of the society. And so the question we had really was, how could we celebrate 50 years of CAS? And the sort of obvious answer to that was to have a CAS50 exhibition of some sort. We thought we would run it over the whole year, partly because of the ambiguity of the start date, but also it meant we had a whole year to do activities. And I hoped that we might be able to get two exhibitions, what I initially calls the phase 1 and then the phase 2. So the phase 1 was 2D works by 12 artists. Some artists gave more than a single piece of work. And then phase 2 was 12 artworks, again 2D artworks by 12 more artists. And it started off as the CAS50 exhibition, I should say, and by the end of this period had become the collection. And what I will do now is I will show you a bit about the collection here. So if I go to this web page, hopefully it's nice and seamless. So the collection started with an approach to these 12 artists. A number of, I think I saw Stephen was here, and Ernest is here, and Sue Gollifer's here. So we've got Andy's possibly here. So we have a number of artists who are actually here today. And the criteria really for this was I wanted to choose work that represented the range of work that was typically associated with the Computer Art Society. So that would be maybe algorithmic and generative work, but also to an extent work inspired by living systems. But there was also a practical concern, which is I wanted to approach people I knew, and I had a high degree of confidence that they would be interested in submitting work to this exhibition. So this first 12 artworks was interesting that everyone said yes. So what we were able to do was put together an exhibition that was first shown in Leicester, where I'm based, and then taken down to Brighton, the Phoenix. And it was also shown at the EVA conference in a smaller form. And I think we probably had a few other smaller showings. And I thought it was I thought it was a successful exhibition. It helped to celebrate 50 years of CAS, but it also demonstrated there was interest in submitting this work and donating it, because we didn't have any budget. We couldn't buy work from the artists. So the artists were donating work. And so it made sense to continue with the phase 2. And the phase 2 of the exhibition, that addressed a few issues that I felt were missing from the first one. Partly I wanted to try and get closer to a better gender balance. Now this is a whole other topic, but I found that when you're looking at, you know, some of the artworks here are 50 years old, and the Computer Art Society in the late 60s, early 70s was largely male dominated. That's not to say there were not a lot of very important female artists, and I've tried to approach a number of those. We've got Sue Gollifer, for example, in the first phase. But at the time, it's difficult to find female stories to add at this present time to the collection. However, I was, given the second phase of the collection, I was able to approach Anna, Ruth Gibson, Gordana, and also, I guess, half of Genetic Moo, Nicola in Genetic Moo. And so this did help address some of the gender balance, but there's more work to be done in the future. I also wanted to look at different ways of making 2D work. And again, the project, I felt we had to focus on 2D work because of some of the difficulties and costs in transporting three-dimensional work or interactive work. But I think that's again something we can look at in the future. So we've got computer drawing work. So I wanted to look at different ways of producing 2D images. So Damien Borowick produces drawing machines that make work. Alex's work here is what you would call an algorithmic image, algorithmic photograph. Esther Robinson draws by hand. We have a piece here by Roger Saunders, a very early piece produced on computer printouts. Brian Reffin Smith, part plotter based and a digital print. Jack Tate's work is early drawing machines, many made by himself. And Patrick Tressett, again, self-made drawing machines with interesting electronics which enable them to make drawings of things that they see, in quotes. So the second phase of collecting really doubled the work we had, up to initially 24 artists here, and we were probably heading towards 40 artworks. A number of artists gave us more than one piece. So that was quite an interesting situation to have, because we introduced, because we introduced the issue of transport and maintaining this collection. Well, the first time the collection came together as a single piece, and actually that initial solution there was the LCB Depot, where I'd run a couple of exhibitions before, offered to store some of the work, and then I stored it in my studio, which wasn't the ideal situation, but it worked for them. So we had this quite large collection of framed artwork stored in those two locations. We had an opportunity to show all of the work together for the first time at event 2 at the RCA. Now, event 2 was named after event 1, and it was another 50th anniversary. So event 1 had run, the Computer Art Society had organised it in 1969, and event 2 followed 50 years later. It's sort of a little bit of an in-joke. At this rate, event 3 will happen in 2069 and so on. And it was organised in collaboration with the EVA conference, in particular Graham Diprose, who put a lot of work into organising the event. Flux Events, who are a group of artists based in London at the moment, but looking to extend their reach. The RCA themselves and other organisations, who I'll show you on the event page. Now, the first event happened at the RCA, but a very different RCA to the one we have now. But we still had access to a great exhibition space. So event 2 brought together all of the existing computer arts, or CAS50 collection, and I added some work from my own collection, which I felt it would be good to have Harold Cohen represented in the collection. So I added one more artist, so that we actually had 25 artists' work featured. So that was the 24 artists in the first 2 phases of collection, and the Harold Cohen works that I'd collected personally. And then in addition to that, Flux Events provided some audio, video and interactive works in one of the spaces, slightly darker space. So we had a really nice exhibition of historic and contemporary work. And I think the general view was that that was a very successful exhibition. There was a great speaker program. And also I actually managed to get some Arts Council funding under my guise of Interact Digital Arts, which is the company I run to support my own practice, but also to run the exhibition program that I do. So again, I'm going to pop over onto the web browser, and you'll see on the top of the CAS homepage, we have event 2, and then everything goes a little bit black and white for the design. So event 2, some background information about who was involved and what happened, a link through to the fairly scant information we had about event 1. Event 1, we have documentation. Catherine Mason wrote an important paper about it. But as you can see, we don't have a huge number of photographs. And that was often the case these days, of course. We're so used to being able to photograph everything with our camera phones. Back then, cameras used film, and films got lost and so on. We had a bit of background information. And what we have here is very extensive documentation of that exhibition, including some VR walkthroughs and panoramas and that sort of thing. So this took, like I say, it took place at the V&A. It ran over a number of days, and the visitors numbered the thousands. It was a very interesting and busy exhibition to run. 12th of July to the 17th of July, 2019. As you can see, various partners were involved. If I go down here, I won't go quite down there. Well, I'll go to the bottom. You can see, so that's the CAS logo, Interact, my company, but then Lumen Arts, Flux Events, the RCA, EVA London, the conference, and then also the V&A, who hosted a sort of student tour through the archives. So for this exhibition, I mentioned that we had the historic work. Well, I'll quickly pop on here. So we have the phase 1 and the phase 2 collections. We also had Art in Flux, which was the show that the Flux Events organisation organised. We've made sure this has been documented on the CAS site, so you can read that and find out a lot about the artists. You can also, Art in Flux are running, they're now actually called Art in Flux rather than Flux Events, and they're running a number of online events that you can participate in. We showed some sound work, presented some sound work. This was on a device that we called the Sound Pod. It mixed some audio from the Cybernetic Serendipity album with contemporary sound art. Sound was always important in early CAS, so I felt it was important to represent it in this exhibition. There are movies, lots of videos. Again, these are available online, so you can look at them. And then this was a really good addition to our archives, interviews by David Upton with a lot of people whose work is in the collection, George Mallin, co-founder of the Computer Art Society. And there's hopes that we can maybe develop these interviews as well. So what we'd ended up with by the end of event 2 was not just 2 collections of print-based work, but a lot of documentation and contextualization from artist interviews and photographs and other material, together with some sound artworks, which are all stored online, video works and so on. So at the end of event 2, which was a very exciting event to run, I was left with a little bit of a question, which was what next? So I think I reflected a little bit to see, really, was this the end or the start of something? Was the event 2 project a great culmination to a year of celebration of CAS, like CAS50 would come to an end? Or might this be the beginning of something else that we could develop further? With the connections we made, the network we built, we certainly had a great opportunity, I think, to develop further. But I asked myself a number of questions. Firstly, had it been worthwhile? Well, all the feedback was positive, so I didn't worry that it had been a vanity project that hadn't really gone anywhere. It was most definitely a worthwhile exercise. Should we expand the collection? If so, this problem of where do we store it was becoming an issue. The work is all framed. Now, of course, we don't have to maintain it all in frames, but at the moment, even if we didn't have it in the frames, we'd have to store the frames. So it has a sort of storage overhead. Are we doing something that would fit into a bigger picture of digital arts archiving? Why don't we just give all the materials to the V&A if they wanted them and say, well, you know, that's the end of our contribution, over to you, or to another collection, or whatever? Or is there something that maybe we could do? Are there other histories that still need telling? And before we consider what to do, in the future with the collection, should we carry on maybe doing some more research and exhibitions and so on? And then there was a question, of course, which is, do we need funding in order to continue this project? Now, we had funding. I got Arts Council funding for this second CAS50 exhibition. The first CAS50 exhibition had support from the Computer Art Society through the BCS. And so we'd managed to do those exhibitions on a sort of a low budget, but still, we'd covered the costs of doing them. But maybe if we were going to develop some ideas further, we would need to consider how we might get funding. Now, in order to do that, I think we would have to have an organisation that actually could take funding, could manage it properly and professionally and transparently. And also we would need to consider how the artworks, some of which are valuable, I'd say all of them are valuable pieces, how they are maintained. They shouldn't belong to a single individual and so on. I'm not going to, but I could have sold them all on eBay at the end of the exhibition. Wouldn't have gone down very well at all. So we had to address that issue. And it also, for me, it brought up some issues about collecting digital art as well. So this collection was not intended, well, it was intended to be on paper, but not because that was the scope of digital art. I don't believe that the only digital art is paper-based or 2D digital art, but it was something that had to be stored, transported, and maintained. And the easiest things to store, transport, and maintain are two-dimensional artworks, particularly works on paper. We know how to store them, we know how to exhibit them, and to an extent we know how to collect them. But of course, if we were to develop this collection further, it would have to go beyond just being 2D work. So it also, at the end of this phase of collecting, I really asked myself, well, how do you collect digital art? And it's not an unusual question. A lot of people are interested in this. I'm a big believer in that the art that tends to get recognized over time is the art that is collected and preserved. A lot of great work is not collected, not preserved, and it's often lost. Even the documentation of it gets lost. So it's very important that we collect a broad range of work, but we ensure that our collection doesn't get lost. So I'm going to share a link to this, but I'll quickly show you a paper here, which raises a couple of questions. Now, this is my paper for the EVA conference this year, and the proceedings are being published, I think fairly soon, actually. And like I mentioned, we hope to have an EVA or a mini EVA later in the year, maybe in November. I'm not going to read out the paper to you. And this was the paper that this presentation came out of. So I've brought people up to date with the scope of the collection here. But I also want to ask some questions about a strategy for collecting computer art. And these are some initial insights, which I think are quite useful, and it's something I'd like to develop further. But when looking at digital artworks, I realized sort of the easiest things to collect, and I'm not saying the least important, but in many ways, the ones you can collect most of, if you like, are printed works. But if you wanted to build a collection of digital artworks that represented the full range of digital arts, we would have to look at moving into other phases. So we would have to look at video-based works, on physical media or in digital form, screen-based artwork, so artworks that run on computers, but maybe on 2D screens, screen-based works, so that you might consider screen-based works running on video loops, screen-based works running on standard computer hardware and software, but then also screen-based works running on specialist computer hardware and software. This is tricky. A lot of the computers that generated the images in the collection are simply not available anymore, or the external devices that made the artwork and so on. And then, of course, we may want to move up to collecting installation works. And I sort of realized that it's highly likely that these earlier stages are going to have a higher representation in the collection than the later ones. It's a lot harder to collect installation works, and you have to do a lot more work to maintain them. So as the collection progresses, we'd like to be able to move up into some of these other areas, but we have to accept that these lower levels, and I don't mean lower in any sort of a sense of the work's not equally good, but these areas are easier to collect, and therefore they're likely to be higher, be represented in the collection. But also, in parallel with collecting digital artworks, it's so important to collect contextualising materials. And that might be publications, papers, and so on, or ephemera. I have a lot of material in my own collection, catalogues, flyers, publicity materials. What I'm realizing now is that they form the sort of second level, or the second parallel layer to the artworks, is the contextualising material. Documentary materials, videos, other materials that we might make, artist interviews, and then potentially collecting algorithms and detailed explanations of the artworks in order to ensure that our collection explains to future generations how these artworks were constructed. Even if the machines aren't available, the algorithms and the process of construction is still, I think, very relevant and will remain relevant in the future. So this really was my initial response to that question: what is the strategy? How do we collect digital art? So I'm going to be sharing these links and this presentation at the end of the talk. So if you want to read that paper, you can. So the response to all of that, really, both the exhibitions, the practical problems of where do we store the work, who does it belong to, and some of the other questions about, is this activity a valuable activity, and so on, really came together with this idea that what we should do is create a computer arts archive, and we should create this as a non-profit organisation. Now, in the UK, the easiest way to create a non-profit is to form something called a community interest company. Community interest companies are incredibly popular, actually, particularly in the arts. They give you a legal framework and a set of responsibilities as a director, but actually have a very low management overhead. You do have to do accounts, but it's not like running a limited company. Limited company has additional responsibilities that you have to do by law. So community interest company was set up at the beginning of the year, and all community interest companies have to have a mission statement. They can also be used for applying for funding. So the funding question, how do we apply for funding? Well, we can apply to funding if we have a well-managed community interest company. And it's registered in England and Wales, but that doesn't mean we can only trade in England and Wales. And it has an official company number, so you can look it up on the UK's Company House website. So if we look at the mission statement, I will read this one out because it took a while to put it together. You know, any mission statement has to try and cover a whole range of things in a concise language, but it shouldn't read like a corporate branding exercise. I think this hopefully gets the balance right. So the Computer Arts Archive is a non-profit company, that's important, that collects, exhibits and promotes computer artwork for the benefit of artists, audiences, curators, educators and researchers. So it covers the collection, exhibition and promotion activities, but also we're very much looking at it being for the benefit of artists. And this would include artists who want their work to be preserved or want it to go somewhere where it's not going to get lost. Audiences, I'm a big believer in that the digital art audience should expect us to help educate them. Digital art audiences, unless they are specialists, general audiences, maybe often still now it's their first digital art exhibition if they go to see one and so on. But we should also be there for curators, educators and researchers. So it collaborates with other collections, museums and galleries to explore the impact of digital culture and to ensure that computer art is recognised as a significant contemporary art form with a rich and diverse history. So the important points there are it's collaborative and it works with other collections. It's always going to be the case that a project like this we're not the V&A, we're not the Smithsonian, we're not these big galleries, we would never want to be. The work we're doing has to be something that we can do in collaboration with other organisations. So I felt that was an important thing to include. It mentions digital culture because digital art is part of digital culture, and the culture we live in now is both informed by the art we have around us, but also other elements of digital technology. And that mission to ensure that the computer art is recognised as a significant contemporary art form with a rich and diverse history. It would be quite easy to say that computer art, well, it's just another art form and it's just art. Why do we need to single out computer art? Well, the terminology may change. Maybe computer art isn't the right term. Perhaps it should be computational art or digital art. But I think there will always be a need for recognition that there is an art form that makes use of computers that is different to art forms that use computers. Photography uses computers, but I wouldn't say it was computer art. And it has a rich and diverse history. And that was something that really alluded to an observation I have, which is when I teach students at different levels, many of them don't really understand the history of digital art and computer art. And a little test of this is that I will often say to students, so can you give me your favorite film? Yes. Can you tell me your favorite painting? Yeah. Favorite photograph? Probably. And you can go through a whole range of art forms, and people will have the knowledge to really make a judgment about what their favorite and non-favorite is. You end up with digital arts, and most students, even on computer art courses, will not have a favorite digital artwork or computer artwork. You'll really have to work quite hard to actually find a piece of work that we might call digital that they might regard as an important work. That's not a criticism of the students. That's really the reality that we need to really work on ensuring that the history of computer art is taught at earlier levels. And then, of course, what we had to say, and is vital, is that we work closely with the Computer Arts Society, a member-based organisation founded in 1968. The Computer Arts Archive is a separate organisation for practical reasons when it comes to funding and so on. We don't want any confusion over how the money is going to be used and where it's going. But we are deeply connected with the Computer Arts Society and its 50-year history. So 2020 was starting to become a very exciting year. We took on an office at the LCB Depot in Leicester. And that is a picture of the office not really set up yet. I had a big project in January, February, so I was looking at March as being the month I was really going to get in this office, get all the work installed, the shelving put up and everything. And then we would launch Computer Arts Archive to the world in June 2020. Well, of course, we had a little bit of an issue here in that in March in the UK, as earlier elsewhere, we started a lockdown. And it was clearly, pretty soon, it became clear that June would not be a realistic date to launch this project. So I was thinking probably November at the earliest, but everything that was going to happen earlier in the year is probably going to happen in November. So it may even be something that we have to push a little bit later. This initially gave me a bit of a problem because my planning had been based around doing fundraising through grants and other forms that would kick in June. And I'd taken on office and I thought, okay, a bit of a problem here. However, I made an application to the Arts Council and to our local authority, Leicester City Council, and both of them have given Interact Digital Arts some financial support, which means that the space we have is safe at least until the end of the year. So I'm not going to have problems raising the rent or paying the rent, should I say. So we now have a bit of time, a bit of breathing time to think about how we might develop the archive further. So what I will do is take you to page here. And this is the holding page for the Computer Arts Archive. So we have that mission statement. So I now say launching November. We have a mission statement and we have some additional background information, just really explaining the history and what we're doing with the project. So that's our mission. That's some background. And I had set up some various mechanisms to enable people to donate to the project. What I would like to do, and I'll come on to it in a slide in a second, is I would like to give people the opportunity to make personal donations, one-off or regular. And I'm sure you're familiar with a system called Patreon. I'd also like to create something that is of value to people who like Patreon subscriptions. So maybe you give us a tenner a month towards the rent, and then at the end of the year, you get a unique, a limited edition print. Or there might be other things that I think Patreons are good, but you have to give people something that they find valuable. It doesn't necessarily have to be an expensive thing, but it has to be something that they like. So where we got up to a couple of months ago was being just about ready. All the infrastructure was in place, just about ready to start working towards a launch. And so what you see here is a holding page, but you don't see all the other materials that I plan to put on here. I've had to focus on different things. But what you would expect to see on the archive would be all of the work in the CAS50 collection together with and catalogued properly, something I'd started doing in a database. displayed in a way that would encourage people to maybe support the project or even commission an exhibition. So if you go back to the presentation here, so everything was ready, and this was in about, like I say, it was ready for me to sort of focus on the project in March. But I'm now looking really to focus on the project in depth, probably in September. I've got a couple of things beforehand, but broadly, I will continue working on the project in my own time anyway. So as well as the CAS50 collection, what are the initial projects that we've been thinking about doing? Well, the first one, of course, is looking at the CAS collection or CAS50 collection. I think I'll still call it the CAS50 collection because it was established to celebrate that 50th anniversary. I'm partway through a collection process of collecting what I might call pioneers. That's not to say the other artists in our work, many of them are very important pioneers, but I thought I would try and focus on collecting some work now that we had a little bit of credibility, shall I say, by computer art pioneers. So that would include Howard Cohen works, but other people as well. And it would be 12 artists again. I'm going to continue collecting the pioneer phase with the hope that we could maybe exhibit it later in 2020. Actually, one thing I haven't mentioned is that the BCS, if you like, are the parent organisation of Computer Art Society, now have a new office in London, an area called Moorgate, and they've given us the ability to put work up in their office on the wall. So actually, at the moment, most of the Computer Arts archive or the CAS50 collection is down at the BCS on the walls, not being looked at by anyone. I'm fine about that. There's not much I can do anyway. We'd planned to bring it back in March when I moved into the new space properly, but we'll look at maybe bringing it back in August, September, whenever. So there'll be a new Pioneers collection, definitely exhibited in Leicester, where I am at the LCB Depot. We have a great art gallery, and we have a supportive organisation who Interact gets that gallery for 2 months a year, or 2 exhibitions a year. And the last couple of years, a summer exhibition has been the Computer Art Society CAS50 exhibition. Then I want to look at another phase, which is video works. Now this is, it may be collecting work that is designed to be delivered as a video, but also it will be collecting works within the collection on video, on long video loops. So it offers a way of showing the work in a non-generative way. It's being played on video, but in something that maybe adds an extra level to showing a print. And I'm working with a local company in my hometown, Loughborough, and we're looking to combine the video works with the 2D works, so you can use a sort of AR app on your phone, point at the artworks, and they'll come alive and show you a video. Of course, that's been paused a little bit with the situation as it stands. And then the next phase next year would be to look at some contemporary work, but to have a sort of quite tight focus on the curation. And I'm particularly interested in contemporary artworks by artists who are aware of that heritage that we have within the collection, or artists certainly who I can see a connection with. Of course, not every artist may be aware of their digital arts heritage, but they can certainly see the connections, I hope. And then a future phase would be to look at collecting interactive works. So the first thing that the archive will do is to continue developing the CAS50 collection. Okay. We also have an area here where, well, a selection of projects to do with our core archiving. So we're starting to be given collections. Jack Tate, who produces drawing machine-based artwork, has given a lot of work, great collection of work. Roger Saunders, who may well be here today, has given some work and some materials from the very early 70s. We have the Inatovich collection that we want to archive and display. And then we've been talking to the EVA conference, EVA London, about ensuring that we have a complete collection of their proceedings and any other documentary materials. That goes back, EVA is now 30, EVA 30. So 30 years of materials there. And then we've talked with Lumen, the Lumen Prize, about having a copy of their archive, Flux events, my own materials as well. I'm looking for the archive to be a home for them. That's not just my own artwork, it's the material that I've collected over the years and others as well. So we have contributed materials that we want to make sure are indexed and included in the collection. But we also are interested in reimagining some early artworks. There's been a sort of a wave of that recently. There's been the Censter, which was the subject of the second presentation in this series, where the Censter has been reconstructed, using some modern technology, but very much in keeping with how it was originally. The Colloquy of Mobiles piece that George Mallin worked on, that Gordon Pask has produced, has been reconstructed. And I've been talking for a little while now with George Mallin about EcoGame, how we might collect materials from that and reimagine it. EcoGame was an early computer piece that involved a simulation of different environmental scenarios, and it just seems so relevant to now. That was done with the Computer Arts Society almost 50 years ago. Works by Stroud Cornock and Ernest Edmonds, in particular the early works such as Data Pack and a lot of Ernest's early interactive pieces. I think we should be looking to collect and reimagine those. And then we've had a chat about the possibility of recreating The Bandit, a early Inatovich piece. Again, that was talked about earlier in these talks, which I think would be very interesting to do. So we have these classic archiving projects. There's also what I might call the lost years. They're not really lost, but they're not necessarily covered by CAS, because CAS wasn't really around in the 80s and 90s. Like I say, there was this gap. And the first two projects looking at that will be to look at microarts. This is Jeff Davis's project of computer artworks that he made in the 80s on a Spectrum. He's also working with a colleague who used a BBC-B. They may not be computers that people outside the UK know, but I'm sure if not, little Tandy, Coco, Colour Computer and other machines were similar. I think this artwork is interesting and important to make sure we don't lose, because it partly was produced in that lost period between the two main phases of CAS, but it was also exploring how these new devices that were now in the home could be used creatively. And our plan is to have a small exhibition of micro artworks at BCS later in the year, November, December. And then I would like to put together a larger project as under my interactive digital arts hat that would take place next summer and would really be an exploration of creativity on those machines. So I'll be looking at art, music, games development and so on, really looking at how these new computers, as they were 8-bit computers, so slow compared to how they are now, influence creativity and development. And certainly in the UK, that era really has had a huge economic benefit to the country, because the people writing those games, exploring the technologies, were the people who formed the games companies that are now doing so well and so on. And then another area that I have a particular interest in is the 90s. I began my sort of proper creative exploration of technology in the 90s. And a few years ago, I ran this exhibition, which was looking at cyberculture. And I showed parts of my collection of work from the era in that exhibition. And it includes CD-ROMs, VHS videos, computer programs on floppy disk, as well as a lot of other materials, prints and so on. And I really want to turn this into a collection. The seed, and you can see, so actually here's a good example. So William Latham's work here, he was mentioned in the first phase of the Computer Arts Society. John Lansdowne did an article about him. In the 90s, I was working with various bands, and one of the bands I was working with commissioned him to make cover art. And at the same time, he was releasing software. So there's a nice, interesting little story there and what William was doing. I've got a lot of books from the era. I used to review books as part of my journalistic activities. And I knew one day these books would become useful again. I've got a huge pile of them. VHS videos, often associated with rave culture, but all produced using computers. Early virtual reality, and then other maybe slightly alternative aspects of that. And even fractals. I think fractals need to be in here somewhere. I'm not saying fractals represent great works of art, but they were often, for many people, the first computer-generated image they saw. So this is just part of, this documents the exhibition, but is part of my archive, which also includes around about 100 CD-ROMs from the late 80s, early 90s, that I think need to be made available, maybe through virtual machines running them and that sort of thing. So there's another area there which I think is particularly interesting. So I'm just about on time, almost finished presentation. So I want to look at these projects as well. Now, of course, the problem is, how do we do all of this work? And there'll be plenty of other things that we want to do. So the first thing to do is we need to come up with a sustainable model for funding the project. So in order to run that office and to ensure that all of our work is insured and protected, we have some basic overheads. And the plan is to look for opportunities for individuals and groups to make contributions through Patreon and PayPal and so on. So ideally, we'd be able to raise our overheads through that. But then we also want to look at grant applications. Arts Council England have been very supportive of my work so far, and I think that support will hopefully continue. I have a high degree of confidence that they would fund the first phase of setting up the space for the archive. And I've also been in touch with the Heritage Lottery, which is a UK-based organisation which looks to use money raised through money raised through the National Lottery for heritage purposes. I've had an initial response which is positive, but of course they're closed down at the moment during the lockdown. Collaborations with companies and universities, being part of research projects and so on, exhibitions. But I think the ideal goal would be, in the long term, more than 2 years away, would be to find a partner or sponsor who's interested in maintaining the collection. And this could be a university, it could even be De Montfort University in Leicester. And that organisation would hopefully maintain the collection in the future. So we've tried to think about the maintaining of this collection in a very practical way, but also keep it open enough that it can respond to new opportunities that present themselves. So that's the end of the presentation part of things. So thank you very much. So this is our address, Computer Arts Archive KIC in Rutland Street, Leicester. That's our email address, web link. That's the company registration number. And this is a start of the logo type for the organisation. As soon as we get a real designer in, that'll change. But for now, that's what I've produced. So hopefully that brings you fully up to date with what the plans are for this project and why it came about and how it came about, really. So I think I do just about have enough time for some questions. So is there anybody out there who would like to ask anything? Well, I can preempt you then by suggesting 2 questions that I have been asked in the past. And oh, there are some questions in here. Oh, okay, great. Well, thanks for the positive support. I think 2 questions that I thought would be interesting to answer, and I wondered if people might ask. One is, how can you donate work to the collection? Because artists would, I'm sure, like to be in with collections. Well, at the moment, it's going to be by invitation, and that's really a practical work. But as Jeff just mentioned, there is the contemporary collection that I'd like to start putting together for next year. So the first thing will be a call to people who are certainly close to the Computer Arts Society, are aware of us and aware of history, is to consider how their work might fit into a collection of the work that we've got so far. So that might mean 2D work or representations of work in 2D that either allude to, refer to, have been influenced by past work, but it might not. It might be brand new things. I'd like to put the call out properly a little bit later this year, but it's to try and put together a really tight, it might be 12 pieces, maybe it's a bit bigger, this collection, of work that represents the state of the art in work that can be represented on paper. And I have artists who I'd like to invite, but I'd like this process to be a little bit more open. I'm not saying the previous processes have been closed in a bad way, but that'd be interesting to get other people's feedback on what work they feel we should include. So there's that opportunity there. There's also coming along to the events and considering how you might want to show the work in your institution. It hasn't travelled abroad yet, but there's no reason why we couldn't send it abroad if the insurance and that sort of thing, everything's in place. So there are opportunities, I think, to show the work elsewhere. I'm just going to check some of these other questions. So, oh, thank you, Catherine. Actually, another option, another thing for art historians like yourself is to maybe consider how this archive might benefit the general archiving of digital art. Is it filling a gap? Should it go in a certain direction to cover hidden stories and so on? There was the Technology is Not Neutral exhibition a few years ago that Anna was involved in. She's in the collection. In fact, a number of those artists from that art collection exhibition of work by female artists were people I approached to go into the second phase of the collection. Do we need to do something like that to produce exhibitions of female work to include to increase the diversity, or maybe we don't need to have dedicated exhibitions? We just need people like people letting me know when there are good female artists that ought to be part of this. I know, obviously I know quite a few, but I'm always willing to take input. So there are other opportunities maybe for historians and people who collect work or interested in work, maybe to give feedback and suggest how the direction goes. There's also helping to support the financial side. And this, I'm not doing a pitch, but potentially when the Patreon goes live, consider if you want to support that, maybe doing individual donations, or maybe if you're putting projects together, consider how the Computer Arts Archive might form part of your project. As you can see, the overheads are fairly low. It doesn't cost a lot to run this at the moment, but I always like to know where the rents are coming from. So I'd like the company to build up a reserve. And also I should mention the directorships of the company. It's just me at the moment. We have a small group. I'm going to invite some people to join, but then also people who might want to volunteer to be on the directorship of the company. You're protected. You don't take on all the liability of the business. You're only an advisor and director. And it might be something that you're interested in putting a bit of time into. So I think I've answered 2 questions, but I asked them myself. Are there any additional questions?
Hi, Sean. I'm trying to speak to you.
Oh, hello. Yeah, please do.
Hi. I was just thinking, you know, because there's so many different things that I haven't seen that you've got in there, and I know lots of the, you know, interests that you have, and I love the fact that it comes over such a sort of diverse cultural. So you've got things that are kind of quite anarchic culture, and also kind of going back, you know, into real sort of contemporary art. You know, just fantastic range. But it also made me think about that you're there as a hub, and that's completely fantastic. But maybe will you be looking to invite other curators perhaps to come in to work with you, or to look at those things, or nearly to sort of take some part of it off to explore it and sort of expand it? Because you can see that you've got all of these different kind of, you know, possible worlds that could all kind of really unfold, but it's more than one person could really possibly ever do. You know, like any collection needs a number of
absolutely. I think more than wanting to, I think it has to. I would like to focus on the areas I'm particularly interested in, but there are many more areas of computer art, digital art histories that need to be looked at. And so, like you say, we can be the hub. We can be where the stuff gets stored, or both online and offline. But I think one measure of success would be the broad range of curators and people who come in to help work on the project.
Well, you could nearly do that by project basis, couldn't you? Rather than, you know, if somebody didn't feel like they could all be working on it, you could invite people in to sort of use some of the material you've got to set up an exhibition. That'd be,
well, you know, who knows which direction it's going to go in, but if funding was available, you know, we might even apply for funding for guest curators.
That.
So you can imagine a 6-month internship, curatorship. Yeah, that would be the sort of funding I'd like to get in, so people can work with the collection, add to it, and so on. Interesting question here from Eva Pascoe about the computers needed to run this work. Well, I don't think I have a picture easy to put them to hand. I have built up a little collection of computers which enable me to run work from the 80s onwards. I've got a very early PC running different versions of Windows, different size floppy disks and things like that. I've got a very early Macs going right back to System 7. So I've tried to get the actual machines to run the work. But of course, that's okay if people are, in their work have been using standard machines. So CD-ROMs are good because they work on early Macs and early PCs. But if somebody has created a piece of work running on a highly specialist computer, it's difficult to actually collect that computer unless they somehow have it and they give it to you, but then where do you store it? So part of that is to look at the different options, running it on old machines, but running it through emulators. Well, emulators aren't ideal, but they do offer an approach. One of the problems is if I'm running a nice new Mac here with a lovely high def screen and everything, if I was to run a ZX Spectrum emulator on here, the window pixel for pixel would be probably like the size of a postage stamp, because the resolution back then was so low. Well, okay, I blow it up to fill the screen. It doesn't look anything like the original image. You have to, even if you're running an emulator, I think you have to run it through the appropriate hardware. And I have a few early screens and monitors that can be used for that. But it does open up quite a significant issue. And I think this is a dialogue that I know a number of people have been involved in, which is how much can we collect the old computers? How much can we emulate? How much do we simply accept that you can't run those old programs anymore? So we collect the surrounding ephemera, images of the artworks, interviews with the artists, code, and it becomes like the archiving of a theatrical performance or an installation piece. You collect the materials and it could be done again in the future, or maybe it now becomes an archive piece. So that's my thinking about older machines. My loft, in fact, I've got my Commodore PET behind me. And my first attempt at making images actually on computer was on a PET, not that actual one, but that era PET, when I was at school, secondary school. And one thing I want to do is revisit some of that early image making, just for personal reasons. I'm not going to claim it's going to make some great artworks, but the process of image making back then, I just like to really get I think by using the machine, you reconnect with things. And I think it's important for me to look at some of those older machines. Okay, looking at some of the other questions here. Great, so thank you. Yeah, thank you for it's Christina. Thank you for that positive comment there. So interactive elements. So the idea of it being an interactive living archive, absolutely, I'd like there to be interactive works in the collection. But I feel that my sort of model for collecting, I do actually, it's more a pyramid than a table, is grounded in ephemera and 2D work. And then hopefully the more interactive stuff is further up the pyramid. And the pyramid, it's a bit narrower at the top, there'll be less of it, but you know, is important, it has to be collected. I'd thought about really approaching that in 3 ways. So screen-based interactive pieces. One approach is to collect the videos of the work running, so at least you can see how the work ran. The other is to collect work that's running on standard platforms, or even creating a standard platform, such as a Raspberry Pi, and then saying to people, give us an image, which would be on an SD card, of your piece of work running on the Raspberry Pi, and we'll maintain that platform, and hopefully over years that will remain and we can still run your work. And then the other is looking at how do you collect some of these more, particularly in the sort of mid phase, in the 80s, late 80s when I went to university, Loughborough University, there were some fantastic terminals, well, terminals and workstations, and I would write simple programs to create images on those. Well, if I wanted to reproduce that work in a way now, I'd have to find those terminals. Well, they may not exist anywhere, or maybe they've ended up in museums and they cost a fortune. You know, you end up with that issue. How do you find access to those machines? Jim Bolton, I mentioned there from Eva. Yes, I do know Jim. We're in regular contact. I think it's important that all organisations trying to address these issues and work together. The new archive office, for example, is next door to a filmmaker who sells a service of copying weird video and film formats onto making them digital. So I don't have to worry about having U-matic tape readers and things like that if I'm next door to somebody like that. So it's good to be able to collaborate. Stephen Bell, I would completely agree. Algorithms are like musical scores. They may be reperformed. And I think that's really important. In fact, maybe you'll be a good person to talk about donating some algorithms to the collection. Good to collect source code. I completely agree. Question there. We do have some early source code. I have the source code for the eco game piece that George Mallin and the Computer Arts Society produced. And it's in a language that I researched it. I can't even remember the name of it now. Nothing runs it, but it's recognizable enough that I could probably recode it in JavaScript and run a simulation of that piece. So having access to the early code is important. It also looks good as well. And so some of Roger Saunders' work that he's donated to the collection has ended up in frames, early printouts in frames on walls. I've also realized that, I remember this from the day, that this sort of stuff fades really quickly. So in future, I'm going to have to make sure that it's stored, well, it's always stored in the dark, but it's probably framed behind UV glass, quite expensive glass, but it has to be done to preserve those early works. VR gallery for international access, that would be amazing. If you could go into virtual reality and look at early computer artworks, very much like the sound of that. Graham Dipro's question comes to, and yes, this is a very important conversation we've had before about archiving. So when it comes to long-term archiving of interactive pieces, where the time-based experience might be lost, UOSs or lost data. Yeah, so we have this issue of having lost the original machines. Potentially we can emulate, but also, Graham, I know you're very keen on the idea of saying, what do we know last 500 years? Well, we know this sort of paper and these sorts of inks last 500 years. So how about we do a printout of an artwork, put the code on the back, or the algorithm diagram, and that's what we send forward. We say, well, we can't send you the interactive piece, but we'll send you enough information to be able to potentially reproduce it. Yeah, thank you. Fascinating project. Archives and education. Now, I'm a big believer in that. I do a lot of STEAM education myself. And as of last year, the only projects I do when I'm teaching young people, and this could be students at university or younger, I always do arts-based projects. So if I want to teach someone how to program, I go to the Computer Arts Society website, I find some images maybe on the in the collection at the V&A, and I say, right, our programming task today is working out how that image was made. And then you learn programming. It's typically for loops and repeat loops and things like that, a little bit of maths. And I will teach programming by doing artworks. And I'll do the same with lighting projects as well. I'll often show students how to program Arduinos by making a light sculpture. I think education is at the heart of this. The work will be indexed, but I do need to get some consultancy, some advice on how to index it in such a way that it will fit into other collections. But also I'd like there to be education resources with as many of the pieces as possible. So, you know, someone like Esther, whose work is done by hand, but follows processes and sequences, you might do a worksheet that goes with your piece. And then if we're doing a workshop with young people or students, the project today might be, right, learn how Esther makes artworks and make your own. So education is very important. And I'd like education to be at the heart of what we're doing. You archive the code in print, yeah, so Graham, that's some part of that. Algorithms, of course, algorithms can be difficult to record, but then I guess that's an ongoing problem. They can also be quite simple. I can describe personally, and I'm not saying everyone should be like this, I can describe the algorithms that are in my work to the extent that I can write them down and you can play them, run the program in your head and make the artwork. So I have simple algorithms, I guess. We have a question from Nick. So Nick's spoken to somebody in the Eco Game software team, so we should get in touch. Non-profit, does that mean non-trading membership scheme? It doesn't mean non-trading, no. So we are a company, we're allowed to generate revenue, but what we mustn't do is pay that revenue out in dividends or use it for things that aren't part of the mission statement. So, for example, if you got a £100,000 grant, we could pay somebody, maybe even pay me or something, to do work on the project, or we could employ a student. But if we ended up at the end with £10,000 profit or unspent grant, that money has to be used within the organisation. We can't take it out as a dividend. Or we can give it, we can donate it, we can set up bursaries and so on. So the company will trade, and clearly it doesn't want to lose money. In fact, it makes sense to make a little bit of money in any business, but that money will always have to go back into the goals of what the business is about. We need to think about physical stuff, real coding. Yeah, I agree. It's from Sue Gollifer. Alex here, from Anna. Beyond the inclusion of more women, it's very important to consider other forms of diversity. In fact, I wasn't so much lying awake thinking about this, but I was thinking about how do you look for diversity, particularly in historic work, where on the surface there isn't a lot of diversity. So you might look at, so like I have done, you go through every issue of Page looking for artists, and you will probably find that over 90% of them are male. And well, you can't tell this by looking at them. They're probably white males. And again, you don't know about other elements of diversity. So what probably needs to happen is that there has to be a time where you have to put time into looking for those harder to see stories. And so that's why technology is not neutral is important, because you're addressing the history of computer art from a female perspective. If we had studentships or associated projects, we could look at other areas of diversity. Now, you might think, well, there's not a lot of diversity in the canon, but there might be certain individuals whose work needs to be raised and shown as examples. Now, a good example is when it comes to maybe the sort of algorithmic generative work, and this person is a brilliant artist, but the fact they're a woman as well is important. So you might look at someone like Vera Molnar, and if you were doing a project where you're looking to show generative work and important work from the earlier eras, then maybe you focus on her work rather than sometimes, like I might do, focusing on male work. All these things, I think, the stories are in there, but you have to dig deep sometimes to find them. Obscure hardware talk. The Computer Conservation Society, absolutely, yes. They're another BCS specialist group, and we should be talking to them if you're trying to get. So for example, I've got a number of spools of paper tape. I don't think there are artworks on here, but I don't know anybody locally who can read a paper tape for me. So an organisation like that would help you to find out what's on it, on magnetic tapes, and so on. And yes, Jeff Davis here. Yeah, so student prizes for new, old, inspired work. I agree. I think that's a really good way of using. If we ever made excess funds or whatever, or we could even do an application, a £500 grant to a student or a graduate, an undergraduate. Is a great way of rewarding good work. And there's a stream of VR work from Afro-American community. Welcome. Okay, that's good. So yeah, so another comment from Eva, and so that's interesting. I think a lot of contemporary artists and contemporary arts organisations like Flux are a lot more diverse in all those measures of diversity. So working with contemporary artists may be a way of addressing the imbalance in diversity across the collection. I'd like, if people can dig out and identify artists and stories from the 70s and 80s who represent a more diverse view of things, I'd be interested in those as well. Okay, so a lot of good questions there. Thank you very much. I think I've managed to get through everything. Okay, so that was really my contribution to the talks. I'm going to put this talk up online with the others on the CAS website. I guess while I'm able to go to the CAS website, what I should mention is the online talks here are all archived, all up to date. This one will go online later. And then next week, we have the, oops, I'm in the wrong place. No, I'm in the right place. We have short talks again. And we have, I think we've got 6 people who said they would be, well, I asked them if they'd be interested, and I assume they are still. Includes Jeff, I know you sent me an email earlier. What I will do now this talk's out of the way, is I'll get in touch with everyone and suggest a few things, how long the talk should be and so on. They're informal and they don't have to be of work that's complete. They might just be a set of ideas for stimulated conversation. So, And there probably is still a few spaces if anyone wants to contact me. So if you were to drop me a line, I can include you in the short talks here. Well, Terry Trickett and Dave Upton, who did the interviews. Terry is going to try and do a bit of a performance, I think, which will be interesting. I think EVA attendees will be familiar with Terry's performances. So he's going to be doing one for us here. So that is the next planned talk, and that's on the 9th of June. And then I mentioned this before, but I plan to have just a little break from doing the weekly talks. And I think they'll probably restart. Well, I was thinking August, but normally people go away on holiday in August. So I was then thinking, well, maybe that's not a good idea, but maybe people aren't going away on holiday this August. So perhaps I should start in August. So I'll probably have the rest of June focusing on something else. And then I'll start collecting speakers. A number of people have expressed interest. And then we'll look at then scheduling the program to start at the beginning of August. If people think that's a bad idea because of holidays and so on, drop me a line and maybe we'll start a little bit later. But what I would like to do with the next set of talks is probably do another set myself of people who I think would be interesting to involve. And then I've been chatting to Nick Lambert, chair of the Computer Arts Society, who's looking to maybe put a season together as well of his own work. And then, or not his own work, of his own interests. And then who knows, after that, maybe we could look at another curated section as well. So again, mail me any suggestions. Just a couple of notes just coming through here.
Sure.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say to everyone, I think we should all give you a clap because you always sort of invite everyone to sort of clap the speaker, and I think you've just done a really brilliant job. And thank you for organising all of these events. We've really loved them.
They've been very interesting, and thank you for making the audience as well. You know, we've got 32 people online, and it is a day where we could go out and have a barbecue and so on. So I'm really happy to see everyone.
We're doing that later.
I'm just going to check these last few comments. So, all right, sharing the presentation. So I've got the presentation as a Google document. I'm going to put a link to that in the notes on the online talk section, together with the video, and then a few other web links. And I'll also make sure that the YouTube video has the presentation in the links as well, so you have access to it. Great. Okay. Well, glad you found it interesting. I'm just checking a few more talks there. Yeah. So I was just saying about the other season. So and the reason I'm going to be doing other things in June is because we have our Leicester event, our Digital Artists in Leicester event, which I will share with this same group. So it's work by artists in my local area, all doing interesting things. Very much be interested in feedback on that. And then I plan in July to really focus on making work myself. So I decided not to give myself any external, apart from a few things that I'm already working on, give myself any external deadlines and so on. And then, like I say, we can start again in August, unless people think August is a bad idea. Okay, well, thanks for all the feedback. And I will share the talk, and I'll see you next week for some short talks, and hopefully hear from some of you next week as well, giving the talks. Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Yeah. See you soon.